Yesterday we talked about how to graph sine given different amplitudes and periods. So today we're going to talk about how to graph cosine. The process is very similar. In fact, as far as the amplitude and the period go, it works the exact same way. So if we have y equals a times cosine of bx, then it is still the case that the amplitude is equal to a, and it is also still the case that you can find the period by doing 2 pi divided by b. So you just take 2 pi and divide it by whatever is in front of the x. And that's how you find the period. So let's go ahead and just graph normal cosine, because really the only difference is how cosine is going to look. Okay, it's still got, we're just graphing normal cosine x here, y equals cosine x. The key is cosine, instead of starting at 0, 0, like sine did, starts up at 1, 0, or whatever your amplitude is. Since this one just has an amplitude of 1, it starts at 1, 0. But it starts on top, then it goes down, hits its valley, then goes back up to right back where it started. And it does that over a period of 2 pi. And you still need to divide each of these periods into 4 pieces to mark the important or the key points. So that would be at pi over 2, pi, and 3 pi over 2. So if you notice how we're labeling this, because I'm sorry, one last thing should be that it goes up to 1 and down to negative 1. You can tell by how we're labeling this that it's the exact same as sine except for its shape, okay? Because it starts up at 1 and then goes down, it's going to take this shape, more of a valley kind of shape, instead of the rolling hills or whatever you want to call sine. Okay, so let's do a couple practice problems. Let's start with this one. It says graph y equals negative 3 cosine x. So first let's just identify the amplitude and the period. Okay, the amplitude is 3. Remember, you always take the absolute value of that number right there. Okay, the amplitude will never ever be negative. It's always the positive version of that number. So our amplitude is 3, and our period is just 2 pi, because the b in this case, the number in front of x, is just 1. So 2 pi over 1 is just 2 pi. So when I come over here, now I have to be careful here because I have a negative. Now since I have a negative, instead of starting up here, it's going to start down here. So this goes this way and peaks and then comes back to where it started. And it takes a total of 2 pi to make that happen. And then when you split this up, it's going to be pi over 2, pi, and 3 pi over 2. And it starts down at negative 3 and works its way up to 3. We know that because the amplitude is 3. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. We're going to keep moving on. For this next one, graph y equals 4 cosine x. The amplitude is 4. And the period is again just 2 pi. Because it's 2 pi over 1, because the understood number in front of that x is 1. So 2 pi over 1. Okay, this one's positive, so it starts up top. So it starts at the top, goes down, and then ends up right back where it started. And it takes 2 pi to do that. One thing we talked about in class that I wanted to make sure you were aware of. Some of you are having trouble figuring out how to do the labeling of these points. I know 2 pi is pretty easy because it's the one you see a lot, but what I originally told you was that you need to take the period and divide by 4, and that would be your increments. And that's still true. 2 pi over 4 is pi over 2, and that is what's going to happen. You're just going to go up by pi over 2 every time. If you look up here, it's 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, which reduces to 1 pi, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, which reduces to 2 pi. But another way you can do it, if you think about this for just a second, let's say we have a line, and I want to cut it in 4 pieces. Well, the simplest way to do that is to cut it in half and then cut those 2 pieces in half. So we can do the same thing to label our points. We're starting over here at 0, so to first cut it in half, we would just find the average between 0 and 2 pi, and that would be pi. And then the average between 0 and pi would be pi over 2, 1/2 pi. The average between 1 pi and 2 pi would be 1.5 pi, or 3 pi over 2. So whichever method is more helpful for you to figure out what those marks are is fine. You can either divide by 4 and then go up by increments of that, or you can cut them in half and find the averages like I did in that problem. I'll try to do both throughout the rest of this lesson so that you can get used to seeing both. Okay, now let's try y equals 5 cosine of 2x. So let's say the amplitude would be 5, and the period is going to be 2 pi over 2, because of that right there. You divide by that number, and so that cancels out and just gives you pi. So our amplitude is 5, our period is pi, excuse me. Okay, we're positive, so we start up top. And we go all the way over to pi, because we go the distance of our period. Okay, so we're starting at 0. If we want to mark them, we're going from 0 to 1 pi, so in the middle would be half of a pi, or pi over 2. In between 0 and 1/2 pi would be 1/4 pi, pi over 4. And in the middle of pi over 2 and pi would be 3/4 pi. Okay, a lot of people get tripped up with the pi's, but if you just focus on the fractions in front, this is really just 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and 1. They all have pi, so you can kind of just ignore them when you're thinking about the fractions. And based on the amplitude, we know this goes up to 5 and down to -5. Okay, let's try the next one. We would have an amplitude of 3, because that's the number out front here. We would have a period of 2 pi over 5. Again, this number comes from here. It's the number in front of x. We call that b. Alright, so when I graph this, I notice that I have a negative. So since it's negative, I have to start down at the bottom. So I start at the bottom, I go up, peak, come back to where I started. And I know that my period is 2 pi over 5. So this end point over here is 2 pi over 5. Okay, so we've done the cutting in half a couple times, so let's do what I said the other day, where you divide by 4. Well, if you do 2/5 divided by 4, that gives you 1/10. So the first mark would be 1/10 pi, or pi over 10. Then it would be 2/10 pi, which reduces to pi over 5. Then it would be 3/10 pi. And then 4/10 pi is the same as 2 pi over 5. Again, whichever method you prefer is fine. Now this goes up to 3 and down to -3. Okay, so this is really very similar to what we did with the sine, but if you need practice, you can look at these pages, 506, and if you look at 31 to 41, you can try the odds or the evens. This was just what I assigned in class this time, but anything in that section would be good for practice.